Pete, do you want to introduce yourself and before you kind of kick off here?
Yeah, I'm Pete Chapman. I'm a software engineer over at QuotaPath. Uh, I started out doing Android development, moved to C++ development, moved into React, fell in love with React, but missed types. And then about 3 years ago, started doing TypeScript. And about 2 years ago, started bugging Cody to learn TypeScript. And I'm here today to just kind of talk about generic components in TypeScript, and because I think it's a topic that isn't addressed all that often, generics in general, and I'm excited to give it. It's more of like fun with uh, components in TypeScript and just like a slow evolution of how you can evolve. So we've already talked about me. I want to start off with like a simple example, and we're going to kind of build off from here. I'm sure everyone's seen something like this, some form of single select list. Like you want a developer to choose what technology is their favorite. And you've probably built out something that looks similar like this. If you're not familiar with TypeScript, I'm going to kind of explain some of the stuff you're looking at real quick. So we're defining single select props here. Think of it like prop types. I think prop types is still the main thing in vanilla JavaScript for React, but we're going to define items as a list of strings selected as a string, and a handler that takes the argument string and returns void, which is TypeScript's way of saying this function is not going to return anything. And as you can see, it's implemented. And how you define the types of the props for the component is after you're destructuring the props, you just do a colon, the types, and that's how TypeScript knows. And so you can very easily implement it like this in the app, and you'll get some compile time guarantees around whether you're missing props or not. And so you've built out this single select, and you're moving along, new features coming along, and a few days later they ask you, hey, can you make this a multi-select? Now we want to poll our users on what they're excited about, not only what their favorite thing is. And so you may build something that looks like this. It's got a little bit of logic to determine if the bits are flipped, if it's selected or not, and it takes like an array of strings, and the callback returns an array of strings. So you get into PR, or you're just like any developer thinking, oh, there's a lot of common functionality, you might want to refactor this. And the approach I've actually seen before from people just like kind of cursory diving into TypeScript and not really having much experience is something like this. And you're looking at a bunch of optional props, selected, optionally a string, multi-selected, all these things that uh, between combinations of two of them may define, and it makes the internal functionality difficult. You've got to figure out what you're, whether you're a single select or a multi-select. You have to do the same thing on the callback listener, whether you're passing in doing the single select callback or the multi-select callback. But it works, and you have a little bit of testable code, and you're able to ship it. But then one day your little Jimmy intern calls you over to his desk and asks, why isn't this working? It's not doing anything. It's not giving me any errors. And you come over, and he didn't implement the listener. And there's got to be a type safe way. This is why you would be using TypeScript. You want to get those compile time guarantees so you know why things aren't working the way they're supposed to work. So the next evolution is you start reading docs and you come across union types. And for those unfamiliar with union types, union is a way of defining a property being multiple things. So in this example, the selected can be a string or an array of strings. And same with the onSelected listener, it can take, it's going to pass up an array or a single string. And this is working better. It's type safe. You're able to not make any mistakes. You no longer have the optional props. You always need to select it on selected, but every single time you want to implement it, you've got to do a check to see, is this an array or not? And like every single developer, we're lazy. We don't want to, have to copy and paste this code all the time. And that's where we're going to start getting into generics. You'll find this under the advanced section of Typescript. Their documentation is amazing. That's between that and all of their issues on GitHub, I've pretty much been able to figure out everything in terms of errors if you just are willing to dig deep enough. But for those unfamiliar with statically typed languages, a generic is being able to create a component that can work over a variety of types rather than a single type. This is perfect. We want a single string or an array of strings in this option. So for those unfamiliar with what generics look like, we've got this type bar. We use the brackets to tell Typescript that bar is a generic, and bar takes t and assigns the property on the object value to t. And so if you want a number bar, you're going to pass in a number. If you want a string, you're going to pass in a string. And if you want a foo bar, you're just going to pass in foo. It's really scalable, and it gets really complex. But it doesn't have to be complex. Like, don't let that scare you away. And so when you're creating a function, you put the generic t in front of the beginning of the fat arrow function, so you can so Typescript knows that it is a generic. And I think a really good example that like clicks when I'm explaining generics to people is actually React, because every single time you create a component, you're really creating this like object, like this function that takes the generic of p, and that's the properties. And so as you can see, like this is straight from the type definitions inside React. And so the select we're building is a function component of the type select props. But we're not only thinking about, well, is this a string or an array of strings? We're actually creating branching functionality. We want to know whether, based on if this is array or not, we have to do some different things inside the component. And that's where we get into tag unions. Tag unions also are known as discriminative types, also abstract data types. They're really powerful, especially in functional programming. They're usually comprised of these three things, and this is once again taken straight from the docs. Types that have a common singleton property, the discriminant, type aliases that take the union of those types, the union, and type guards on the common property. So here is kind of like the galaxy brain refactor of this code. And so we've got this select kind, which is an enum that is single or multi. As we saw in the previous slide, we're going to use that as the common singleton property. And we're going to create two different options for the props. We've got the single select props, which always has the kind property of select kind.single. And it takes an array of t, in this case strings. Selected is a single string, and unselected passes up a single string. And so then we're also going to create the multi-select, which is the same thing, but with arrays and the kind property being select kind.multi. And so we're going to take those two things and go back to the type alias that takes the union of these types. And so we're going to create this generic type, the generic select props, that is the union of those two generic types. And we're going to start writing our component. So the third thing that we need is the type guards. So we have these two type guards, is multi-select, is single select. And so we're just going to pass in the properties of the component and return a Boolean value that's just evaluating the equality of the kind property. And because we're returning a Boolean, we're able to use the fancy is keyword in TypeScript that allows TypeScript to know which type of the union it actually is. So just for brevity, we're going to build out two helpful functions outside the scope of the component. Is selected, which is a function that takes an item and returns whether it's selected or not, and handle selected, which is a wrapper for the callback. And as you can see, this if statement, if it is multi-select, it's going to return two things that handle logic for the array functionality, the multi-select. And if it's not a multi-select, we know it's a single select, and it's going to return the required functions for the single select. And so, we're able to build this nice and clean component that just kind of works, and you don't need to think about, you don't have to worry about your intern possibly messing up the code in terms of just like optional props and losing those type safe guarantees. You don't need to worry about doing the like checking to see if it's an array of strings in the parent implementer, and it just works. But wait, the next day your manager is like, we also want to know their favorite numbers. And it's super awesome because now that you've built this generic component, instead of strings, you could just easily, it works with numbers, and everything is just magic with TypeScript. And that's it. Questions from the chat?
That was awesome. I have a question. This is like a great opportunity because I'm just like learning all these things. I guess like with generics, like, and you're passing, when you're passing like the type as just like a letter, like T, for example. Is that because like that's kind of because you're trying to keep things relatively vague and shorthand, or is it more so because like if you use very long names, like the code can get kind of like cluttered and stuff? Like what's sort of the philosophy behind naming your types like that?
For myself, I tend to, if it's just a single, like one or two, I'll do T and U. That tends to be the standard. In QuotaPath code base, we have some complex objects that take like 8 different generics, and we are able to, we just name those out. And so like, I think it just depends on coding style. But yeah, I think T is just kind of the accepted for like if you are doing a single, but it won't hurt to name it out if you want. I also think as you start using a lot of generics as building blocks, just keeping T across the board makes more sense, as opposed to like you might, in one thing it might be called foo, and then it's getting passed into something that's like the generic of bar.
That does make sense. It's kind of like a convention that follows you through. Very cool. Are there any questions in Twitch chat? I love the I love the galaxy brain story there. What is your favorite part of TypeScript?
I mean, it's really the compile time guarantees. It makes me feel like I am a better developer because I'm breaking things a lot less. Usually in the code bases I work in, like it's entirely TypeScript with no any's allowed. And so like you just more often than not know when something breaks.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I always get very excited when we like Pete and I talk about this stuff quite often, and whenever like you're talking about just like how sort of type safe, and like with the goal of almost approaching like runtime safe that you can make things, it just like it seems so crazy to think like that could be how things are if you really utilize TypeScript to its full potential. Comment from Ryan: we're JS devs, aren't we supposed to be living on the edge?
I mean, Dino came out. Isn't that living on the edge?
That's right. Um, else, so other than T, what are the available naming schemas for generics? That is a question.
You can use like usually it's like TUV I see a lot of, but uh, anything more than that, like if you're passing in a bunch of objects, like a bunch of things, it's easier to like just be as descriptive as possible. Like if you're just kind of like building a black box abstraction,
Mm-hmm.
like at that point, I think being as descriptive as possible is almost documentation. But just helper utilities and things like that. T.
Yeah. It sounds
Uh,
like if I'm making a function with like one argument, it might be reasonable to have it shorthand, right? Like just like a x y whatever. But the more arguments you get, you start to lose that sense of what is what if you don't have good names.
yeah, definitely. To circle back, I thought of one other thing I really love about TypeScript. I love how the type system is Turing complete. And I know Cody, and maybe if Ryan's in the audience, you guys have seen some of the stuff I do with like dynamically creating types inside the types and just being able to like wrap in it. Like for example, forms. I have this thing called provisional that takes the type of the object and it iterates through everything recursively and just will say, all right, while it's in the form state, it's this or null. And then I'm able to like use a type guard to say, okay, now this is a valid type.
Yeah, that's incredible. When you send stuff like that over to me, like it feels like I'm like unscrolling like one of the Elder Scrolls, and I'm just kind of like, oh my god.
Yeah, usually those are after like 8 hours in the middle of the night, me just like having this idea and just trying to figure out how to make TypeScript work with the idea.
Very cool. All right, Twitch. Any other questions?
Oh, I didn't realize I was sharing.
I managed to slide your thing over though. It worked out. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Pete. We appreciate your time and your talk.